Good evening. Tonight we're doing something a little different. Instead of stepping into the past, we're going to stay right here, in the present, in your ordinary Tuesday, and look at it through a pair of eyes that don't belong to this century. We're going to imagine a woman from 1952 standing quietly in the corner of your kitchen, your office, your car, your bathroom, watching you live your completely unremarkable day. And we're going to find out that your unremarkable day would, to her, look like a small miracle stacked on top of another small miracle, over and over until she had to sit down. Before we get into it, I want to say something to the people who have been with this channel for a while now. Every single topic idea that's landed in the comment section gets read. Everyone. Some of you have been asking for this exact video for weeks, a companion piece to the Housewife episode, and here it is. So thank you genuinely for shaping what this channel becomes. If you're new here, welcome, and if you'd like to support the channel, a like or a subscribe helps more than you'd think, though only if you actually feel like giving one. No guilt tactics in this house, and if you'd rather listen than watch, we're on Spotify now too, link in the description, perfect for exactly this kind of night. Now get settled. Turn the lights down low, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, pull the blanket up over your shoulder, and let your body sink into the mattress the way it only can at the end of a long day. Tonight isn't going to ask anything of you. It's just going to walk you gently through your own life slowly, at a pace that makes it strange again, until the strangeness turns into sleep. Let's start with a question. What if you could show a woman from 1952 your debit card? Not your salary, not your job title, not your opinions, just the plastic rectangle in your wallet with your own name embossed on it. What would she make of it? Would she understand what it meant that this object required no husband's signature, no permission slip, no cosigner standing behind her like a chaperone at a dance? Would she turn it over in her hands the way you'd examine something recovered from a shipwreck, ordinary to you, impossible to her? And what about the rest of it? The apartment lease with only your name on it. The car parked outside registered to you and you alone. The passport in the drawer that you can use whenever you like, for wherever you like, without asking anyone's blessing. What would she think of the pill bottle in your medicine cabinet that lets you decide, actually decide, when or if your body becomes someone else's responsibility too? What would she think of the fact that you can walk into a bank today and open an account by yourself? That you can walk into a courtroom and end a marriage on the simple grounds that you no longer wish to be in it? That you can walk into a doctor's office and be spoken to as the primary authority on your own body? Now, congratulations. It's this morning, in your own home, in your own century, and you're about to live an entire day made of things that would have seemed like science fiction to a woman standing exactly where you're standing 70 years ago. Let's walk through it together slowly and let her watch. The alarm goes off, and here is the first shock before you've even opened your eyes. You reach over and silence it with your thumb, and then, and this is the part that would genuinely stop her breath, you go back to sleep for 9 more minutes. You hit snooze. You, a grown woman with responsibilities, with a job, with people depending on you, decide unilaterally that the day can simply wait 9 minutes and nothing collapses. No one is standing outside the bedroom door registering disappointment. No performance has been missed. The ceiling does not fall in. You just close your eyes again because you wanted to, and that was allowed. Think about what that actually requires as a premise. It requires that your mornings belong to you before they belong to anyone else. The 1950s Housewife's morning belonged, structurally and completely, to the people who would soon be awake around her. Yours belongs for at least 9 extra minutes to you and the specific gravitational pull of a warm pillow. This is not a small thing. This is a woman deciding that her own comfort has enough legitimacy to delay the start of the world. And if that sentence sounds unremarkable to you, that is precisely the point. It was not always unremarkable. It had to be one. You get up eventually in your own time, and here comes shock number 2. Delivered so casually you'd never notice it happening. You do not get dressed first. You do not, as a rule of household law, present yourself to another human being before you've had coffee. You shuffle to the kitchen in whatever combination of sweatpants and old t-shirt you slept in, hair doing something that has never once been described as intentional, and nobody in the house, if there is anybody else in the house, registers this as a failure of any kind. If you live alone, there is an entire universe of mornings that exist for no witness at all, mornings that belong exclusively to you, and perhaps a cat who has opinions but no power to enforce them. A 1950s domestic guide would have found this scene alarming on multiple fronts at once. Where was the pressed house dress? Where was the lipstick applied before anyone could see the bare face beneath it? Where was the woman who had risen an hour early specifically, so that her unpreparedness would never be witnessed by another living soul? You skipped that hour entirely. You spent it sleeping, or scrolling, or simply existing in a body that had not yet been arranged for public consumption, and the day proceeded regardless. The coffee itself deserves a moment, because here is where the technology gap becomes almost comedic. You press a button. That's the whole process. A machine that lives on your counter, purchased for less than a week's modern grocery bill, produces a consistent, hot, competently made cup of coffee without requiring you to master a percolator, monitor a flame, or absorb decades of accumulated domestic anxiety about whether your coffee was good enough to reflect well on your character. There is no advertisement anywhere suggesting that a poorly made cup of coffee might put your relationship at risk. If the coffee is bad, you shrug, and you make another one, or you don't, and either way your marriage, should you have one, remains statistically unaffected. You might drink this coffee standing up, scrolling through a phone that contains, incidentally, more computing power than existed in the entire city of Chicago in 1952. You might read the news on it, actual global news, updated within the hour, requiring no husband to bring home the evening paper and summarize the parts he thought you'd want to know. You have direct access to the entire informational apparatus of the modern world, unfiltered, unmediated by anyone's judgment about what a woman needs to be told, and you access it while standing in your kitchen in mismatched socks before you've even brushed your teeth. Now here's where it gets interesting, because what you do next depends entirely on what kind of day this is, and that plurality of possibility is itself the shock. You might be getting ready for an office. You might be getting ready to work from the very kitchen table you're standing beside, in pajama bottoms, on a laptop, participating in a meeting with people scattered across 4 time zones, contributing ideas that get recorded in minutes and attributed to your name specifically. You might be getting ready for nothing at all, a day intentionally kept empty, unaccounted for, unowed to anyone, which is a category of day that did not meaningfully exist for the woman standing in the corner of your kitchen watching all this unfold. Let's sit with the job for a moment, because this is where the ground genuinely shifts. If you work, you are not working in the coded, apologetic register of the 1950s working wife, the woman whose employment implicitly announced that her husband's income had failed some invisible test. You are, in enormous numbers, simply a professional. Nobody assumes your job exists because a man in your life came up short. Nobody requires an explanation. Your paycheck, when it arrives, has your name on it, goes into an account with your name on it, and is spent, saved, or invested according to decisions that are, legally and practically, entirely yours to make. Consider the account itself for a second, the sheer administrative fact of it. Until 1974, in the country most of you are watching this from, a bank could legally require a married woman to bring her husband along to co-sign for a credit card, regardless of her own income, her own credit history, her own competence with money that had been, for decades, quietly and completely hers to manage at the grocery store level, while remaining entirely someone else's to control at the institutional level. That law is younger than most of your parents. Somewhere out there right now is a woman older than that piece of legislation, who remembers a version of adulthood in which her financial identity was legally contingent on a man's willingness to vouch for her. You didn't have to ask anyone to vouch for you this morning. You paid for your coffee, if you bought it, with a tap of a phone, an object that also happens to know your location at all times, hold every photograph you've ever taken, and connect you instantly to nearly anyone else alive, none of which requires anyone's permission to use, own, or understand. We're going to keep walking through this day, hour by hour, and by the time we're finished, you're going to have a very different relationship with the word ordinary. But for now, let's pause here at the coffee at the beginning and let it breathe a little. Let the fan hum. Let your eyes get heavy. There is so much more day left to walk through together, and none of it needs to be rushed. Let's talk about what happens when you leave the house, because this is where the woman in the corner of your kitchen would need to sit down entirely, possibly with a hand pressed to her chest. You get in a car. Maybe it's your car, purchased with money you earned, financed through a loan that required your signature and nobody else's, insured under a policy that lists you as the primary and only driver. You back out of the driveway alone. You drive alone. Nobody has asked where you're going. Nobody expects you to have asked permission for this errand, this commute, this entire excursion into the world beyond your own front door. If you live in a city, you might instead walk to a train platform, or hail a car through an app that tells a stranger exactly where to find you, tracks the route in real time, and shares your location with anyone you choose, all of which you trust implicitly, correctly, as an entirely unremarkable feature of getting from one place to another. Think about what driving alone actually represents as a historical artifact. The 1950s suburb was engineered, physically and deliberately, around a single car per household, and that car left with the husband each morning. A woman without independent transportation in a landscape specifically designed to require it was not merely inconvenienced. She was structurally confined, her days shaped entirely by whatever remained within walking distance or whatever schedule her husband's absence permitted. You do not experience your car as a philosophical statement. You experience it as a Tuesday, but it is quietly one of the more radical objects in your life, a machine that gives you unsupervised, unaccountable movement through the world, available whenever you decide you'd like to use it, for reasons you owe no one. Now you arrive somewhere, let's say an office, and here the shocks begin arriving faster than they can be fully absorbed. You walk in wearing trousers. Actual trousers, comfortable ones, not a novelty, not a scandal, not a declaration of anything at all beyond the fact that they were practical, and you liked them. There was a time within living memory when a woman wearing trousers to certain workplaces would have generated actual disciplinary conversation, when the specific fabric draped over your legs was considered meaningful information about your character. Today, nobody in the building has registered your pants as a topic. They have moved on to discussing the quarterly numbers, and you are expected to have an opinion about those instead, an opinion that will be recorded, considered, and potentially acted upon by people who outrank you. You might be the person running the meeting. Not assisting the person running the meeting, not taking notes for the person running the meeting, not fetching coffee for the people in the meeting, but standing at the front of the room, directing the conversation, making a decision that a dozen other adults, some of them men, will implement because you told them to. In 1952, a woman in a position of direct authority over male subordinates was rare enough to be treated as a novelty in the business press, written up with a kind of anthropological curiosity, as though a woman giving instructions to a man and having those instructions followed without incident was itself the interesting part of the story. You do this on a Tuesday and nobody writes an article about it. This unremarkability is, again, exactly the point. Consider your email inbox for a moment, because even this mundane technology represents a kind of authority that would have seemed extraordinary. You send a message and it arrives instantly, unfiltered, unmediated, directly under your own name, carrying your own argument, your own tone, your own conclusions. And the person receiving it responds to you, specifically, as the source of the idea. There is no male colleague required to relay your suggestion in his own voice for it to be taken seriously. There is no folder of memos passing through a chain of men before your name gets attached at the bottom as an afterthought. Your words arrive as yours, and they are evaluated as yours, for better or worse, which is a kind of exposure that also happens to be a kind of power. Let's talk about your body for a moment, because this is where the gap between your Tuesday and her 1952 becomes almost impossible to fully articulate without simply listing facts and letting them sit there in their own weight. You take a small pill each morning, or you have an implant, or an IUD, or you use one of a dozen other methods. And this decision, this quiet daily or long-term choice, determines whether your body becomes responsible for another human being. This is not a decision you make with your husband's approval if you have a husband. It is not a decision you make with a doctor's paternalistic gatekeeping standing between you and the choice. In most cases, it is simply a decision, yours, private, unremarkable, filled at a pharmacy by a pharmacist who does not require anyone's permission, but your own to hand over the bag. The birth control pill was approved for contraceptive use in the United States in 1960, and even then, several states initially restricted its availability to married women only, as though the state itself needed reassurance that a woman's reproductive choices were still, in some legally recognized sense, connected to a husband's oversight. It would take until 1972, through a Supreme Court case called Eisenstadt versus Baird, for unmarried women to gain a constitutionally recognized right to access contraception on the same terms as married women. Sit with that date for a second. 1972. There are women alive right now, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, women who might be sitting in your own family's living room at Thanksgiving, who spent the first years of their adult lives in a country where their unmarried bodies were not fully understood legally to belong to them in this specific respect. You made a doctor's appointment recently, let's say, and something interesting happened, or rather, something interesting didn't happen, and its absence is the whole point. The doctor spoke to you. Not about you, to a husband standing beside you, not around you as though you were a case file requiring translation into terms a woman could safely absorb, but directly to you, describing your own body, your own symptoms, your own treatment options, and asking for your own informed consent before proceeding. This seems like the only reasonable way medicine could function. It has not always been the way medicine functioned. The 1950s doctor was frequently the final word on a woman's body, a word she was expected to receive rather than negotiate, delivered in a register that assumed she required guidance rather than partnership. If you were pregnant right now, this Tuesday in this life, you would very likely be an active participant in your own labor and delivery, informed about your options, consulted about your preferences, awake and present for the birth of your own child, rather than receiving that child afterward as an accomplished fact assembled, while you were sedated into a passive spectator of your own body's most significant event. The routine use of twilight sleep, a combination of morphine and scopolamine that left many 1950s women with no memory of giving birth at all, has been almost entirely abandoned in modern obstetric practice, not because the drug stopped working, but because the entire philosophy of what a laboring woman was owed, information, agency, memory of her own experience, changed underneath the practice. Let's step outside again because there's more day to walk through, and the sun is higher now, and there's a version of you moving through a city or a town doing something that would have been almost unthinkable 70 years ago, eating lunch alone in public at a restaurant by choice. This sounds like nothing. It is, in fact, nothing to you. You walk into a cafe, you sit at a table for one, you order food, you eat it, perhaps reading a book or scrolling a phone or simply looking out the window at the street, and nobody at any point treats this as a situation requiring explanation. Nobody assumes you've been stood up. Nobody offers you sympathy for eating unaccompanied. The waiter does not hover with concern. You are simply a customer, alone, by your own design, occupying a table that seats one exactly as comfortably as it seats four. There were, In the mid-20th century, actual documented instances of restaurants declining to seat unaccompanied women at certain hours, on certain nights, at certain establishments, operating on the assumption that a woman alone in a restaurant after dark was either a problem to be managed or an embarrassment to be avoided. Entire categories of public space, bars, certain restaurants, certain hotel lobbies, operated under an unspoken or sometimes explicitly spoken understanding that an unaccompanied woman required either a male escort or a very good explanation. You walked in for a sandwich. You didn't think about any of this. That is exactly the mechanism by which progress becomes invisible. The fight disappears, and only the freedom remains, worn so lightly it no longer feels like it was ever fought for at all. Let's talk about travel for a moment, because it's connected to this same thread. If you wanted to this weekend, you could book a flight alone to another city, another country, another continent, using a card with your own name on it, carrying a passport issued in your own name, requiring no permission slip from any man to cross an international border. You could check into a hotel room alone. You could rent a car alone. You could spend 3 days wandering a foreign city by yourself, answerable to absolutely nobody about your itinerary, your safety decisions, your budget, or your reasons. A married woman in many American states in the early 1950s could, in practice, if not always strictly in law, find her ability to do exactly this constrained by a husband's expectations, by the social assumption that a wife's movement through the world existed within the perimeter of her household's needs. Passports themselves, for married women, were in various periods and places issued or amended in ways that referenced the husband's name and status, treating the wife's identity as something legally appended to his rather than standing independently. You don't think about any of this when you tap your passport against a scanner at the airport. You should, occasionally, because the tap itself is the inheritance. We're going to keep going, deeper into the afternoon, into the specific mechanics of how you handle money, how you handle disagreement, how you handle your own name, and eventually into what happens when a marriage doesn't work, and what that costs you now versus what it cost her then. But let's rest here a moment first. Let the weight of the morning settle. Let your breathing slow down to match the pace of the voice in your ear. There's a great deal of day left, and none of us are in any hurry to finish it. Let's talk about money now properly, because this is the thread that runs underneath almost everything else we've walked through so far, and it deserves its own long, quiet look. Sometime this afternoon, you might check your bank balance. You do this without ceremony, without asking, without a weekly envelope of cash handed to you by someone else calibrated to what he decided the household required. You open an app, you look at a number, and that number belongs to you in the fullest legal sense available to any citizen. If you want to move money from checking to savings, you do it. If you want to invest some of it, you open a brokerage account in your own name, and you buy shares of a company. And you own that fraction of that company as completely and unambiguously as any man who did the same thing beside you. This was not always so simple, and the simplicity is worth pausing on, because it is a very young simplicity. We touched on this in the last section, but it's worth sitting inside the specifics for a moment slowly, the way you'd sit inside a warm bath. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which made it illegal for a bank to deny a woman a credit card or a loan on the basis of her sex, or to require a husband's co-signature for a woman applying on her own income, was not signed into law until 1974. Before that year, a woman with a steady job, a strong income, an impeccable history of paying every bill on time, could still be turned away from a credit application, or quietly required to bring her husband along to vouch for her, as though her own name on her own paycheck was not, in the eyes of the lending institution, sufficient information about her reliability. Sit with the practical texture of that for a second. Imagine being 40 years old, having worked for 2 decades, having raised children, having managed a household budget with the kind of precision that would embarrass most modern accountants, and still needing a man's signature to open a store credit card. Imagine the specific quiet indignity of standing at a counter, filling out a form, watching the clerk's eyes move down to the line requiring a husband's name and signature, and having to explain again that yes, this is still required, no, your own employment history is not sufficient on its own. This was not ancient history. This was the lived adult experience of women who, in many cases, are still alive today. Women who might be your grandmother, your great-aunt, the elderly woman who lives 2 doors down and waters her garden every evening at 6. You didn't experience any version of this today. You bought something online this afternoon, maybe a book, a pair of shoes, something forgettable, and you paid for it with a card that has your name embossed across the front, linked to an account that has never once required a man's permission to exist. The transaction took 4 seconds. Multiply that transaction by every purchase you've made since you turned 18, and you begin to see the sheer accumulated volume of independence stacked invisibly into your ordinary life. Independence so total and so unremarked upon that you would never think to describe it as independence at all. You would just call it Tuesday. Let's talk about disagreement now, because this is a smaller thing, almost domestic in scale, but it threads through everything else we've discussed. At some point today, maybe over lunch with a friend, maybe in a meeting, maybe at dinner with a partner, you had an opinion, and you said it out loud in your own voice, without first calculating whether the opinion was appropriately modest, whether it might make a man in the room uncomfortable, whether it violated some unwritten rule about a woman's role being to reflect and support rather than to challenge and contribute. If someone disagreed with you, you probably disagreed back, and the conversation continued, and nobody left the room. This is such a small, ordinary human interaction that it barely registers as a freedom at all. It simply feels like talking. But remember the specific texture of what the domestic guides of the 1950s actually prescribed. A wife's dinner conversation was to remain pleasant. Her husband's assessment of the news, of politics, of anything at all, was not a subject for genuine contest. She might, at most, offer a gentle observation, carefully calibrated to avoid the appearance of correction, because correction, however accurate, however gently delivered, was read as a disruption of the domestic atmosphere she was responsible for maintaining. A woman who disagreed anyway, who said the actual thing she thought rather than the softened, deferential version of it, was not participating in ordinary conversation by the standards of the era. She was quietly breaking a rule, one small rebellion at a time, invisible to anyone but herself and the husband across the table. You did this today, probably several times, without noticing, without cost, without consequence beyond the ordinary friction of 2 people who see something differently. That absence of cost is the entire revolution, compressed into a sentence you said out loud without flinching. Let's talk about your name, because this one is quieter still, and stranger in its own way than almost anything else we've covered. If you're married, you may have kept your name. Your own name, the one your parents gave you, the one attached to every professional accomplishment you'd built before the wedding, the one on your diploma, your license, your published work, your reputation. Nobody required you to give it up. If you did change it, that was also genuinely a choice, one you could have declined without legal consequence, without your marriage license being denied, without a clerk raising an eyebrow. Either way, the decision was yours to make, weighed against your own priorities, your own sense of identity, your own calculation about professional continuity versus family symbolism. For most of American history, a married woman's legal identity was substantially absorbed into her husband's under a doctrine with roots in English common law called coverture, under which a wife's separate legal existence was, in a formal sense, suspended for the duration of the marriage. She could not, in many jurisdictions and for much of this history, sue or be sued in her own name, hold property independently, or enter contracts without her husband's involvement. By the 1950s, coverture in its most extreme historical form had eroded considerably, but its residue remained everywhere, in banking, in property law, and the assumption, so ordinary it required no explanation, that a married woman's name, her identity, her formal presence in the world's paperwork existed primarily through her husband's. You changed your name or you didn't, and either way you decided, and the deciding is the point, not the outcome. Now let's go somewhere heavier. Because it's been building underneath everything we've discussed so far, and it deserves the space to be walked through slowly, carefully, the way you'd walk through a room you knew held something difficult. Let's talk about what happens when a marriage doesn't work. Imagine, for a moment, that things aren't going well in a relationship you're in. Maybe it's been unhappy for a long time. Maybe something happened that simply cannot be repaired. Maybe you've just quietly, over the course of years, become a different person than the one who said yes to this arrangement, and the arrangement no longer fits. Whatever the reason, you have, sitting in your back pocket, this entire Tuesday, an option that a woman in 1952 did not meaningfully have. You can leave. Not easily, necessarily. Not without grief, without complication, without the genuine difficulty that accompanies the ending of any significant relationship. But you can leave, legally, on your own initiative, for reasons that require no proof of fault, no courtroom demonstration of adultery or cruelty or abandonment. Nearly every state in the country now offers some form of no-fault divorce, meaning you can end a marriage simply by stating that irreconcilable differences exist, that the marriage has broken down, without needing to prove that anyone did anything specifically wrong. California became the first state to adopt no-fault divorce in 1969. It would take until 2010, remarkably recently, for New York, the last holdout, to follow suit. Sit with that timeline for a second, because it reframes something you might have assumed was ancient, settled history. There are people alive right now, people your own age perhaps, who were born into a country where, in certain states, a woman who simply wanted out of a marriage, who had no dramatic story of cruelty or infidelity to present to a judge, who simply knew with total clarity that she could not continue, had no clean legal path to leave. She needed a story the court would accept. If her actual story was simply exhaustion, incompatibility, the slow erosion of a life that no longer fit her, that story was not, for decades, sufficient grounds. And even when the legal grounds existed, the financial architecture of leaving remained, for the 1950s housewife, close to prohibitive. We talked about this in the earlier housewife episode, but it's worth returning to now, in direct contrast with your own Tuesday, because the contrast is the entire point of tonight's story. A woman who had spent 10 or 15 years managing a household, raising children, running a budget with real skill and real discipline, often emerged from that decade and a half with no credit history in her own name, no employment record recent enough to be competitive, no independent savings, no pension, nothing to rebuild a financial life from beyond whatever alimony a court chose to award, and whatever portion of it her ex-husband actually chose to pay. You do not carry that same structural vulnerability, or at least, you don't carry it by design. If you leave a marriage today, you leave with your own credit history, built over years of your own financial transactions, entirely independent of your marital status. You leave with your own retirement accounts, in most cases, accumulated in your own name through your own employment. You leave, if you've been working, with your own resume, current, competitive, unbroken by the assumption that your labor for the last decade doesn't count as labor because it happened inside a household, rather than an office. This does not mean divorce is easy or cheap or without real financial cost, particularly for women who have taken time away from paid work to raise children, a reality that still, even now, disproportionately falls on women, and still, even now, creates real economic vulnerability. But the floor beneath you is different. The floor beneath you was built deliberately by women who did not have one. Let's also talk about what doesn't happen anymore, at least not legally, at least not with the same institutional backing it once had. If you leave a marriage today, no doctor is likely to suggest, as a matter of routine clinical wisdom, that your distress is simply a difficulty adjusting to your role, treatable primarily through a tranquilizer rather than a structural change in your circumstances. If you tell a therapist, and you very likely have access to one, in a way that would have seemed almost fantastical to the average 1950s housewife, whose emotional distress was far more likely to be met with a prescription than a conversation, that you are unhappy specifically because of the shape of your life rather than some internal defect requiring correction, that therapist is trained to consider the possibility that your life, not you, might be the thing that needs to change. We're going to keep walking through this day, and this contrast for a long while yet, into evening, into the specific texture of what a modern relationship actually looks like when it does work, into parenting, into the particular freedoms of being unmarried entirely, into aging, into old age, into the whole long arc of a modern woman's life, laid up against the narrow corridor, available to the woman standing in the corner of your kitchen at the very start of this story. But let's rest again here for a moment. Let the weight of what we just walked through settle without urgency. There's no need to carry all of it at once. Let your eyes close if they want to. The voice will still be here. Let's move into the evening now, because the evening of your day looks almost nothing like the evening of hers, and the differences are worth sitting inside slowly, one at a time, the way you'd examine something under a soft lamp. Somewhere around 6, if you have a partner, they might come home, or you might come home to them. And here is where the whole architecture of the household reveals itself most clearly, because there is no architecture in the way there used to be. There is no ritual transformation required of you in the hour before his arrival, no house dress to shed, no fresh lipstick applied specifically for the benefit of his eyes at the door, no strategic positioning of dinner so that it can pause exactly 20 minutes before he walks in so that you are not caught mid-labor when he crosses the threshold. If dinner isn't ready, dinner isn't ready. You say so. Nobody's evening collapses because of it. More than that, dinner itself might not even be something you alone produced. It might be something you cooked together, standing at a counter side by side, or something he cooked entirely while you sat at the table doing something else, working, reading, simply existing without contribution, because the assumption that meal production belongs to you specifically by virtue of your sex has weakened considerably, unevenly, imperfectly, but weakened nonetheless, in millions of modern households. Studies on the division of household labor still show, consistently, that women continue to perform more of it than men, even in dual-income households, even now, and that imbalance is real and worth nomming rather than glossing over with false triumph. But the imbalance today is a negotiation, a friction point, a subject of actual arguments that get it out loud at kitchen tables, rather than a fixed law of nature accepted without discussion by both parties as simply how things are. Think about the specific shape of that difference. The 1950s domestic guides did not describe the division of household labor as unfair, because unfair implies an alternative that was imaginable and rejected. For most of the culture surrounding that decade, there was no serious alternative on the table. The wife cooked, cleaned, and managed the children because that was, functionally, an uncontested premise, not a policy up for debate. Tonight, in your kitchen, if the division of labor feels unequal, you can say so, out loud, and the conversation that follows might be uncomfortable, might be unresolved, might require several more conversations before anything actually shifts, but it is a conversation that is understood by both people in the room to be legitimate. The premise is contestable. That contestability is, quietly, one of the larger revolutions embedded in your ordinary Tuesday evening. Let's talk about the specific mechanics of a modern disagreement with a partner, because it illustrates something worth dwelling on. Say you and your partner disagree about something real, finances, a job offer, where to live, whether to have children at all. In the 1950s framework we described in the earlier episode, the husband's judgment on matters of this scale carried a kind of default authority, reinforced by his position as primary earner, primary legal signatory, primary decision maker in nearly every domain that required an external institution's recognition. A wife's preference mattered, certainly, and many marriages of that era involved real partnership and real mutual respect within the private walls of the home. But structurally, formally, when push came to shove, the deciding vote in most consequential matters belonged to him, because the entire legal and financial apparatus surrounding the marriage was built to recognize his authority first. Tonight, if you and your partner disagree about whether to move cities for a job, the decision is a genuine negotiation between two people who each hold independent legal and financial standing. If it's your job offer, your name is the one on the new lease, your income the one funding the move, your career the one being weighed against his, and the negotiation between you carries actual, comparable weight on both sides, because there is no structural thumb on the scale defaulting the final say to one gender over the other. This does not mean modern relationships are free of imbalance. Of course they are not. Imbalances of income, of ambition, of who compromises more over the life of a marriage persist in every kind of household. But the imbalance today is specific to the two people involved, their particular personalities, their particular history, rather than a default setting built into the institution of marriage itself before either of them ever spoke a vow. Let's turn to parenting now, because this is where some of the most profound and most quietly revolutionary shifts have occurred. Shifts so gradual that most people living through them never fully registered the scale of what was changing underneath their own family dinner table. If you have children, you very likely expect, and receive, some meaningful participation from their father in their daily care. Not universally, not perfectly, and certainly not equally in every household. The data on this remains genuinely mixed and genuinely worth examining honestly rather than through rose-colored nostalgia for how far we've come. But the expectation itself has shifted in a way that would have seemed almost unintelligible to the 1950s domestic guides. Fathers today attend births in the room, awake, present, often as active participants rather than packing anxiously in a separate waiting room down the hall smoking cigarettes, while doctors handled everything beyond his reach. Fathers change diapers without it being remarked upon as an act of unusual heroism. Fathers take parental leave in a growing number of workplaces, formally recognized and paid, treating early childcare as a responsibility that belongs to both parents rather than exclusively to the mother by biological default. The concept of paternity leave itself is instructive here. Sweden introduced the world's first paid parental leave available to fathers in 1974. The United States, by contrast, still has no federal guarantee of paid parental leave for either parent, a genuinely striking fact worth sitting with rather than glossing past. One of the areas where the picture of modern progress is considerably more complicated and less triumphant than a simple story of steady improvement would suggest. But even within that gap, individual households, individual employers, individual fathers have shifted the practical, daily texture of who gets up at 2 in the morning, who handles the pediatrician appointments, who manages the school pickup schedule, in ways that would have been almost sociologically remarkable in 1952. Consider the pediatrician appointment itself, actually, because it's a small window into a much larger shift. If you take your child to the doctor today, you are treated, by default, as a competent, informed decision maker in your child's care, someone capable of asking questions, pushing back on a recommendation, seeking a second opinion, researching a diagnosis independently, and arriving at the follow-up appointment with your own informed perspective rather than simply receiving instructions to be implemented without negotiation. Dr. Spock's enormously influential 1946 guide, which we discussed in the earlier episode, assumed a mother who received guidance rather than one who contributed to a genuine dialogue about her own child's care. The pediatric relationship today, at its best, functions considerably more like a partnership, and considerably less like a directive handed down from an authority whose judgment was not meant to be questioned. Let's talk about something quieter still, something that barely registers as a topic at all in modern life precisely because it has become so unremarkable. The choice not to have children. If you have decided, or are deciding, or are simply living your life without having made any firm decision either way, to not have children, this choice exists for you today in a way that would have been almost sociologically invisible in 1952. Childlessness in that era, particularly for a married woman, was frequently treated as a medical problem to be solved, a source of social pity, an implicit failure of the fundamental purpose the culture had assigned to her. The total fertility rate we discussed in the earlier episode, over 3.5 children per woman at its 1957 peak, reflected not simply personal preference but an entire cultural apparatus, medical, religious, social, economic, oriented toward the assumption that a married woman's life would necessarily include children, multiple children, and that a woman who deviated from this path required an explanation, sympathy, or correction. Today, the choice to remain child-free is one option among several equally legitimate paths, discussed openly, written about extensively, chosen by a meaningfully growing percentage of American women, according to data from the Pew Research Center and the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics tracking the rise in women reaching the end of their reproductive years without having had children. This is not a story of children becoming less valued. It is a story of the path toward or away from children becoming, for the first time in a widely visible way, an actual choice rather than a biological and cultural inevitability presented as the only conceivable shape a woman's adult life could take. Now let's talk about something that connects directly to that thread. The experience of simply being unmarried at 30, at 40, at 50, without it functioning as a kind of ambient social emergency. If you are single tonight by choice, by circumstance, by the simple accumulated arithmetic of a life that hasn't yet or may never include a spouse, you are living inside a category that barely existed as a stable, respectable, unremarkable identity in 1952. The term spinster, which by the mid-20th century had accumulated centuries of specifically negative cultural weight, carried real social and economic consequences for the women it was applied to. Women who existed, in the framework of that era, in a kind of unresolved waiting room, their adult lives treated as provisional, incomplete, awaiting the marriage that would finally make them into what a woman was actually supposed to become. You tonight, single or not, are simply a person whose adult status requires no marital qualifier to be considered complete. You can own property alone, which you can, and you likely give this fact no thought whatsoever, walking into a mortgage broker's office and applying based on your own income, your own credit history, your own capacity to make the payments, with no requirement that a husband's name appear anywhere on the deed. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 addressed housing discrimination broadly, but the specific practical reality of a single woman obtaining a mortgage independently was, for much of the mid-20th century, genuinely difficult, lenders frequently discounting a woman's income entirely or partially when calculating loan eligibility, on the assumption that her employment was temporary, provisional, likely to end the moment she married or had children. Regardless of her actual career trajectory or her actual intentions, you own your home, or you rent your apartment, or you're saving toward either, and the entire financial apparatus surrounding that goal treats you as a full economic actor, evaluated on your own merits, your own numbers, your own history, rather than as a kind of temporary economic unit awaiting completion by marriage. This is such a foundational assumption of your adult life that it would never occur to you to describe it as a freedom. It simply is the shape of things. That invisibility, again, is the entire inheritance, worn so lightly that it no longer registers as something that had to be built. Let's slow down here for a moment and let all of this settle, the way sediment settles in still water. We've covered a great deal of ground tonight already, morning to evening, money to marriage to motherhood, and there's still more ahead of us, into aging, into friendship, into the specific quiet texture of a modern woman's inner life, the thoughts she's permitted to have and say out loud that would have lived only in a nightstand novel 70 years ago. But rest a moment first. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm. The night is long, and we are in no hurry to reach its end. Let's talk about your friendships now, because even this, something that seems like the most natural thing in the world, carries a different texture than it did for the woman standing quietly in the corner of your kitchen at the start of this story. If you called a friend today, or texted her, or saw her for coffee, the conversation likely ranged freely across whatever was actually on your mind. Your job, your frustrations with your partner if you have one, your ambitions, your fears, your genuine and unfiltered opinion about the state of your own life, including the parts that weren't going well. You did not need to calibrate this conversation the way the women at the 1950s coffee morning calibrated theirs, translating real difficulty into the acceptable register of a mild, relatable complaint, careful never to admit to anything that might constitute a genuine crack in the presented surface of a well-managed life. Think about what that calibration actually cost, multiplied across an entire generation of women, meeting weekly in identical kitchens across identical suburbs, each of them managing a private interior life that could only be discussed in the most oblique, deniable terms, hedged carefully enough to be walked back if the listener's face suggested alarm rather than understanding. You don't do this math consciously when you vent to a friend about a bad day at work or a fight with your partner. You just talk. But the ease with which you talk openly, without the constant background calculation of how much truth is socially survivable, is itself an inheritance, built slowly, conversation by conversation, by women who pushed a little further each time, who said the true thing instead of the acceptable thing, and found that the friendship survived the honesty. Consider also who you're friends with, and how you became friends with them. Many of your closest relationships might exist entirely outside the geography of your own street, built instead through work, through school, through interests you pursued independently, through online communities organized around anything from a hobby to a shared professional field to a shared experience of some specific difficulty. The 1950s suburb, as we discussed at length in the earlier episode, organized women's friendships almost entirely around proximity. The women who happened to live on your particular street, in your particular development, within the particular radius a woman without a car could reasonably reach on foot. Your friendships today are organized around choice and shared interest to a degree that would have been almost unimaginable to a woman whose social world was largely predetermined by a real estate purchase her husband had made. Now let's talk about therapy, because this deserves real space, real time, and a genuinely careful accounting of what it represents. If you're struggling with something right now, anxiety, a difficult marriage, dissatisfaction with the shape of your life that you can't quite name, you very likely have access to a therapist, a trained professional whose entire job is to sit with you, listen to you, and help you understand the actual structural or emotional sources of your distress, rather than simply prescribing a sedative and sending you back into the exact conditions that produced the distress in the first place. This is not a universal or perfect system. Access to quality mental health care remains genuinely unequal in the United States, shaped by income, insurance, geography, and a persistent shortage of providers in many areas. And this is worth nomming honestly rather than glossing over. But the basic premise available to you, that your unhappiness might have a legitimate external cause worth examining and addressing rather than an internal defect requiring chemical correction, represents a genuinely different framework than the one available to the woman in 1952. We talked, in the earlier episode, about Milltown, the tranquilizer that became the best-selling pharmaceutical in American history within 2 years of its 1955 introduction. Prescribed overwhelmingly to women. We talked about Valium arriving in 1963 and eventually surpassing it. The clinical framework surrounding both drugs treated a woman's anxiety, her restlessness, her difficulty adjusting, largely as an individual problem requiring an individual pharmacological solution, rather than as potentially rational information about an unsustainable set of external conditions. If a modern therapist hears you describe a level of isolation, exhaustion, and suppressed ambition comparable to what many 1950s housewives quietly lived with, that therapist has been trained, at least in principle, to ask what in your actual circumstances might need to change, not simply what dosage might make the circumstances easier to bear unchanged. The language itself matters here too. You have access, right now, tonight, to actual clinical vocabulary for what you might be experiencing. Burnout, a term that didn't enter common psychological usage until the 1970s. Postpartum depression, formally recognized and increasingly screened for, rather than dismissed as a natural adjustment period a new mother would simply settle into given time. The specific, gendered exhaustion of carrying a disproportionate share of household and emotional labor even within a nominally equal partnership. A phenomenon researchers now call the mental load, has an actual name, has been actually studied, has actual language you can use to describe it to your partner, your friends, your therapist, rather than the wordless. Formless dissatisfaction, Betty Friedan spent an entire book trying to give a name to in 1963. Let's turn to education for a moment, because this is foundational to nearly everything else we've discussed, the root system beneath all the other branches. If you attended college, you did so in numbers that would have seemed extraordinary to anyone surveying the landscape of 1952. Women now earn a majority of bachelor's degrees awarded in the United States, a majority of master's degrees, and have, since around 2006, earned close to half of all doctoral and professional degrees, according to data tracked by the National Center for Education Statistics. This is a genuinely recent shift. As late as the early 1970s, men still significantly outnumbered women in undergraduate enrollment nationally. The Title IX legislation of 1972, which prohibited sex discrimination in any educational program receiving federal funding, transformed not just college athletics, which is where it's most commonly remembered, but admissions policies, academic programs, and institutional resources across the entire landscape of American higher education. Consider what this meant practically for a woman in 1952 who wanted to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a scientist. It wasn't simply a matter of personal ambition or aptitude. Many professional schools maintained explicit or effectively enforced quotas, limiting the number of women admitted, regardless of qualification. Harvard Medical School did not admit its first female students until 1945, and even after that formal barrier fell, the culture within many such institutions remained actively hostile, treating a woman's presence in the lecture hall as a novelty to be tolerated rather than a colleague to be welcomed. Today, women make up roughly half of medical school enrollment nationally, a figure that reflects not a single dramatic legal change, but the accumulated effect of decades of women pushing through doors that had been, for generations before them, simply locked. If you have a specific professional credential, a law degree, a medical license, a doctorate, a certification in some skilled trade that once excluded women almost entirely, you carry, quietly embedded in that credential, the accumulated effort of thousands of women who fought, individually and collectively, for the specific right you're now exercising without a second thought. You studied for the exam. You didn't think about the fight. That's precisely how the fight is supposed to end. Invisibly, absorbed so completely into ordinary life that it no longer requires acknowledgement, only occasional remembering, on nights exactly like this one. Now let's talk about your physical safety and autonomy, a heavier subject, and one worth handling carefully and honestly rather than either overselling how far things have come or ignoring the genuine progress that exists alongside genuine remaining danger. If you exercise regularly at a gym, running outside in an organized sports league, you're participating in a level of institutional support and cultural normalization that simply did not exist for women in 1952. Before Title IX, athletic opportunities for girls and women at the school and college level were minimal, often limited to a handful of activities considered appropriately feminine, with negligible funding, negligible coaching resources, and negligible cultural respect compared to what was available to boys and men. The transformation since then has been enormous. Women's collegiate and professional sports now draw genuine audiences, genuine investment, and genuine cultural recognition. However imperfectly and unequally compared to men's sports, the resources still remain. If something happens to you, a physical assault, an act of violence, you have legal protections and institutional structures that, while still deeply imperfect in practice, simply did not exist in any comparable form 70 years ago. Marital rape was not considered a crime in all 50 states until 1993, a fact worth sitting with in complete silence for a moment, because it means that, for the entire span of the 1950s and for decades beyond it, a husband's sexual access to his wife's body was, in the eyes of the law in most of the country, not a matter requiring her ongoing consent at all. Domestic violence, similarly, was for most of the 20th century treated by law enforcement as a private family matter rather than a criminal one, with police frequently declining to intervene, arrest, or even formally document what would today be recognized and prosecuted as assault. The Violence Against Women Act, passed in 1994, represented one of the first comprehensive federal efforts to treat these crimes with the legal seriousness they warrant, funding shelters, training law enforcement, and creating federal protections that simply had no equivalent in 1952. None of this means the work is finished, and a responsible telling of this story has to say that plainly rather than wrapping everything in a bow of completed progress. Domestic violence remains a serious and persistent problem. Sexual assault remains underreported and underprosecuted. Workplace harassment, though now illegal under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as interpreted through subsequent case law, remains a lived reality for enormous numbers of women, and the legal existence of a protection is not the same thing as its consistent enforcement. But the legal and cultural framework you're operating inside tonight, the framework that says your body belongs to you, that violence against you is a crime rather than a domestic matter, that your workplace is legally required to be free of certain forms of harassment, did not exist in any comparable form for the woman standing in the corner of your 1952 kitchen. She had, in a very real and legally documented sense, less protection than you carry with you tonight without thinking about it at all. Let's bring this back down to something gentler before we continue, because we've covered heavy ground and it deserves a moment to breathe. Think about something as simple as walking to your car alone at night from a well-lit parking lot, phone in your pocket, capable of summoning help instantly if something felt wrong, capable of sharing your location with a friend who's tracking your walk home, capable of calling for a car that will arrive within minutes, driven by someone whose identity, license plate, and route are all recorded and traceable. None of this makes the world perfectly safe, and no honest telling of this story would claim it does. But the layers of technological and legal infrastructure now standing quietly between you and danger, infrastructure you rarely think about because it simply exists, represent decades of advocacy, legislation, and technological development that the woman in 1952 simply did not have available to her. We're going to keep going into the final stretches of this day now, into what it means to grow older as a woman today versus what it meant then, into the specific quiet freedom of your own inner life, the thoughts you're allowed to have without needing to translate them into an acceptable register for anyone else's comfort. Rest here a moment. Let your body sink deeper into wherever you're lying. There's still more night ahead of us, and none of it needs to be rushed. Let's talk about growing older now, because this is a subject the 1950s domestic culture handled with a particular kind of quiet dread, and one that looks meaningfully different from where you're sitting tonight. If you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or beyond, you are living through a version of aging that carries more institutional and financial protection than the woman in 1952 could have counted on. If you've worked for any meaningful stretch of your adult life, you likely have a retirement account in your own name, a 401k or an IRA or a pension, accumulated through your own employment, belonging to you regardless of your marital status, regardless of whether a marriage lasts, ends, or was ever entered into at all. You are entitled, under Social Security, to benefits calculated on your own earnings record if that record produces a higher benefit than what you'd receive as a spouse, a system that, however imperfect in accounting for years spent on unpaid caregiving, still recognizes your own working life as economically significant in its own right. The 1950s housewife, as we discussed in real depth in the earlier episode, built no independent retirement of her own through her decades of labor inside the home, because that labor, however extensive, however skilled, however essential to the functioning of the household economy, was not counted as employment in any system that generated benefits. Her financial security in old age depended entirely on her husband's pension, if he had one, on his Social Security benefit, calculated on his earnings alone, and on whatever savings the household had managed to accumulate under his name. A woman widowed or divorced late in life, after decades of exactly this kind of labor, could find herself in genuine financial precarity, her decades of unpaid work having generated no independent financial identity whatsoever. Consider what it means, then, that you can imagine your own old age as something you're building actively, right now, through your own choices, your own career, your own investments, rather than something you're simply hoping will be provided for adequately by someone else's foresight. This is not a small psychological difference. It's the difference between being a stakeholder in your own future and being, in the most literal financial sense, a dependent of someone else's planning. Let's talk about your body again, but from a different angle this time, the angle of simple self-presentation, because even this carries a weight of history worth noticing. If you decided today not to wear makeup, that decision required no justification. If you decided to wear a great deal of it, that also required no justification. If you cut your hair short, grew it long, dyed it a color nature never intended, wore clothes chosen entirely for your own comfort rather than anyone else's assessment of what a woman doing housework should look like, none of these choices carried the specific ideological weight they carried for the 1950s housewife, for whom appearance was not self-expression, but a continuous, unpaid performance of competence and character, monitored, however informally, by an entire community organized around exactly this kind of mutual visibility. We discussed, in the earlier episode, the specific logic of the house dress, structured, ironed, worn even for the dirtiest domestic labor, because a woman's appearance was read as a direct reflection of her inner discipline. You might spend today in leggings that have never once been ironed, and nobody in your life will read this as evidence of some deeper failing. The garment has been entirely uncoupled from the moral judgment it used to carry, and this uncoupling, this simple freedom to dress for your own comfort rather than for an audience's assessment of your character, represents an enormous, almost invisible liberation from a burden that occupied real hours of the 1950s housewife's actual week. Now let's talk about your voice in the political and civic life of the country, because this thread runs quietly underneath everything else we've discussed tonight. If you voted in the last election, you did so as an unremarkable exercise of a right that women in this country have held formally only since the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, a date that feels, on the surface, comfortably distant from your own life, until you remember that this means your own great-grandmother, in many cases, was born into a country where her mother could not vote at all. And even after 1920, the practical reality of voting access remained deeply unequal along racial lines for decades longer, with black women in particular facing the same discriminatory barriers: poll taxes, literacy tests, outright intimidation, that suppressed black voter participation broadly, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 began, imperfectly and against fierce ongoing resistance, to dismantle them. If you've ever run for office, served on a local school board, testified at a city council meeting, organized a petition, or simply posted a political opinion online under your own name without fear of specific social catastrophe, you're participating in civic life in a way that would have seemed genuinely startling to the 1950s domestic guides, which offered no serious vision of a woman's political voice extending meaningfully beyond her influence over her husband's own opinions. Gently expressed at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right tone, the number of women serving in the United States Congress has grown from a small handful in 1952 to well over 100 in recent sessions, according to data tracked by the Center for American Women and Politics at Rutgers University. A genuinely dramatic shift, though one that still falls short of proportional representation relative to the population. Women have served as governors, as Secretary of State, as Speaker of the House, as Vice President, positions that existed throughout the 1950s entirely and exclusively as men's work, not through any formal legal barrier by that point, but through a cultural consensus so total it required no legal barrier at all. Let's turn inward now, because this is perhaps the quietest and most significant shift of all, quieter even than the legal and financial changes we've spent so much of tonight walking through. Think about the specific freedom of your own thoughts, right now, tonight, lying in the dark. You are permitted, culturally and personally, to want things beyond the domestic sphere, and to say so out loud to the people in your life, without it being read as evidence of ingratitude or a character flaw requiring correction. If you want a promotion, you can say so. If you want to travel alone, you can say so. If you're not sure you want children at all, or a marriage at all, or any of the specific milestones the culture around you might expect, you can hold that uncertainty openly, discuss it with friends, write about it, without the specific, particular danger the woman in 1952 faced. The danger of a private thought becoming a public liability the moment it was spoken aloud. We talked in the earlier episode about the novel in the nightstand drawer, the one with the cracked spine, containing women with complicated inner lives, read privately, in the specific 30 minutes before sleep, because reading about a woman who wanted things and pursued them was one of the only ways of acknowledging that this same wanting existed inside her own head. You don't need the nightstand drawer anymore, not in the same way. Your wanting doesn't need to be smuggled in through fiction and metabolized privately in silence. You can simply say what you want, out loud in daylight, to people who are expected, at minimum, to take the statement seriously rather than treating it as a symptom requiring management. This is, in some ways, the largest and least measurable of all the freedoms we've discussed tonight, because it doesn't show up in a law or a statistic. It shows up in the simple fact that your inner life and your outer life are permitted to match each other, mostly, imperfectly, but genuinely, in a way that was structurally impossible for the woman standing in the corner of your kitchen at the start of this story. She was required to perform a version of herself that diverged continuously from what she actually felt, and the psychological cost of that continuous divergence, the Milltown, the nightstand novels, the formless dissatisfaction Betty Friedan finally gave language to in 1963, was real, measurable, and largely invisible to the culture producing it. Your dissatisfactions when you have them, and you will have them, because no century has ever produced a life free of dissatisfaction, are at least legible to you, describable, discussable, actionable in a way that hers frequently were not. This doesn't mean your life is easy. It means your life is, in a very specific and historically recent sense, yours in a way that hers, despite everything she managed, everything she endured, everything she built quietly within the narrow space she was given, was not fully allowed to be. We're nearing the end of this particular day now, this long walk through your own ordinary Tuesday held up against her extraordinary constraint. There's still a little further to go, into the closing hours of the evening, into sleep itself, and into what all of this actually means, gathered together at the very end. Rest here a moment longer. Let the weight of everything we've walked through settle gently, without urgency, the way it's meant to. Let's talk about your evenings now, the part of the day that belongs, at least in part, to nothing productive at all. If you spend an hour tonight, or will spend one later this week, doing something entirely for your own pleasure, reading a novel with no domestic justification required, watching something you chose specifically because you wanted to watch it, practicing an instrument, painting, running, simply sitting with a cup of tea, and doing absolutely nothing of measurable use to anyone, this hour exists for you as an unremarkable feature of adult life. Nobody requires you to justify it. Nobody expects it to produce a tangible household benefit before it can be considered legitimate. The 1950s housewife's leisure, where it existed at all, existed largely within the cracks of a schedule built entirely around other people's needs, and even there, it was frequently repurposed into something that could be read as productive. Reading was permissible because it was quiet and required no household resources. A hobby was more easily justified if it produced something useful, a sewn garment, a baked good for the church social, a skill that ultimately served the family rather than existing purely for her own satisfaction. Leisure that served no one but herself carried a specific kind of quiet guilt that the domestic culture of the era was not shy about reinforcing. A woman found simply relaxing, doing nothing, mid-afternoon, was a woman who might be judged, by herself as much as by anyone watching, as not managing her time correctly. You don't carry that same guilt, or you carry considerably less of it, when you close your laptop at the end of the day and do something that produces nothing except your own enjoyment. This might seem like the smallest freedom of all the ones we've discussed tonight. It might, in fact, be one of the largest, because it touches something very close to the basic premise of being a full person, rather than an instrument calibrated entirely to other people's comfort. The premise that your own pleasure requires no external justification to be worth pursuing. Let's talk now about what it means to simply live alone, by choice, for years, possibly for your entire adult life, because this is a category of existence that has expanded enormously, and that would have seemed genuinely strange to the culture surrounding the 1950s housewife. If you live by yourself, in an apartment or a house that belongs entirely to you, decorated according to your own taste, run on your own schedule, silent when you want it silent, and full of whatever music or television or company you choose when you don't, you're living inside an arrangement that a significant and growing percentage of American adults now choose, according to Census Bureau data tracking the rise of single-person households over the past several decades. This arrangement was, for a woman in 1952, difficult to sustain both financially and socially. Financially, because the wage gap of the era, combined with the employment discrimination we've discussed at length, made independent living on a woman's income alone genuinely difficult in many cases. Socially, because a woman living alone, particularly past a certain age, was frequently read through the lens of the spinster stereotype, her situation interpreted as an unfortunate failure to secure a husband rather than a genuine, chosen way of living a full adult life. You might live alone because you haven't found the right partner yet. You might live alone because you've deliberately chosen not to share your domestic space with anyone. You might live alone after a divorce, or the end of a long relationship, or the death of a partner, and in every one of these cases, the arrangement itself carries no automatic social diminishment. Nobody assumes your solitary living arrangement to be evidence of a deficient life. Some of your friends might, in fact, express genuine envy at the specific freedom of an entirely self-directed household, evidence of how thoroughly the cultural framework around solo living has shifted from pity to, in many contexts, something closer to aspiration. Now let's talk about pregnancy and work, because this is an area where legal protection has expanded significantly, even as real gaps remain. If you became pregnant while employed, you are protected, under the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, from being fired, demoted, or otherwise penalized specifically because of your pregnancy, a protection that simply did not exist in federal law before that year. Before 1978, a pregnant employee in many states and many industries could be dismissed outright, the assumption being, often stated explicitly in company policy, that a pregnant woman's employment was naturally coming to an end regardless of her own preference or capability to continue working. The Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993 further established that eligible employees are entitled to take unpaid, job-protected leave for the birth of a child, without fear of losing their position entirely during their absence, though the United States remains, notably, one of the only wealthy nations in the world without a federal guarantee of paid parental leave. A genuine gap worth naming honestly rather than folding into a story of uncomplicated progress. Still, the specific protection against outright termination for the fact of pregnancy itself represents a real and significant shift from the world the 1950s working woman, rare as she was in this specific circumstance, would have navigated without any comparable safety net. Consider what this means in practical terms. If you're pregnant and working today, you can plan, realistically, to return to your job after giving birth, to continue your career trajectory largely uninterrupted by the specific fact of having become a mother, at least in terms of the formal legal protections available to you. However imperfectly enforced those protections sometimes are in practice. The 1950s working woman who became pregnant frequently faced a much starker choice: continue working with no legal protection against dismissal specifically for her condition, or leave the workforce entirely, often permanently, with no formal expectation or legal mechanism supporting her eventual return. Let's turn now to midlife health, specifically to something that received almost no serious medical or cultural attention throughout the 1950s: menopause. If you're navigating perimenopause or menopause right now, or will in the coming years, you have access to a body of medical research, treatment options, and increasingly open cultural conversation that simply did not exist for the woman in 1952. Menopause in that era was frequently treated within medicine with a kind of dismissive vagueness. Its symptoms, the hot flashes, the mood changes, the sleep disruption, folded into the same broad, imprecise category of female nervous complaint that produced so many Milltown prescriptions in the same decades. The specific hormonal mechanisms underlying menopause were understood, medically, in considerably less detail than they are today, and the treatment options available were correspondingly limited. Today, you can walk into a doctor's office and have an actual, informed conversation about hormone replacement therapy, about the specific trade-offs and benefits involved, informed by decades of subsequent research, including the large-scale women's health initiative studies that have refined medical understanding of these trade-offs considerably since the therapy's more uncritical embrace in earlier decades. You can find community, in person or online, with other women navigating the same transition, sharing information, comparing experiences, in a way that stands in real contrast to the private, largely unspoken experience of the midlife 1950s woman, who often received little more than a vague acknowledgement that this was simply a phase to be endured quietly, much like everything else. Let's slow down again for a moment, because we've moved through a great deal of ground, hour by hour, decade by decade, and it's worth just resting inside the accumulated weight of it for a moment before we continue. Let your shoulders drop a little further into whatever surface you're resting against. Let the pace of your own breathing slow to match the pace of this voice. There is still a little more road ahead of us tonight, and then we'll bring this long day to its close together. Let's talk about owning a business, because this is a category of independence that carries its own specific legal history worth walking through slowly. If you run your own business today, a shop, a consulting practice, an online store, a restaurant, anything at all bearing your own name and your own decisions at its center, you did so by applying for a business license, opening a business bank account, and if you needed capital, applying for a loan, all of it processed on the basis of your own creditworthiness and your own business plan. This sounds like the only reasonable way any of this could function. It was not, for a remarkably long stretch of American history, the reality available to women attempting the same thing. We've already discussed the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, which addressed personal credit. But business lending carried its own separate, entrenched patterns of discrimination that persisted well beyond that date, informal but pervasive, with women entrepreneurs facing systematically higher rejection rates and smaller loan amounts than men presenting comparable business plans. According to research, the Small Business Administration has tracked over subsequent decades. It wasn't until the Women's Business Ownership Act of 1988 that federal law formally prohibited banks from requiring a woman to have a male relative co-sign a business loan, a requirement that, remarkably, had persisted in practice in various forms right up until that legislation, meaning the specific, formal legal right to start a business on your own financial standing, without a man's signature backing your application, is younger than most working professionals reading this sentence. Sit with that for a moment. 1988. If you know a woman in her 60s who started a business early in her career, there's a real chance she remembers a loan officer's assumption, spoken or unspoken, that her husband's signature, regardless of her own financial standing, was simply part of the paperwork. Today, the Small Business Administration reports that women own more than 12 million businesses in the United States, according to recent Census Bureau data, generating trillions of dollars in combined revenue, an entire economic universe that the lending practices of just a few decades ago would have made structurally difficult to build at anything close to this scale. Let's talk now about something the 1950s culture had essentially no vocabulary for at all. The woman who loves another woman and lives that love openly, married in most of the country, with the same legal recognition as any other couple. This subject deserves careful, honest handling, because the history here is genuinely heavier than almost anything else we've discussed tonight. Throughout the 1950s, homosexuality was not simply socially discouraged. It was actively criminalized in most states, treated by the psychiatric establishment as a mental illness to be corrected rather than an identity to be respected, and pursued, in various periods, by federal policy explicitly aimed at removing gay and lesbian employees from government positions, a campaign historians now refer to as the Lavender Scare, running roughly parallel to, and often intertwined with the anti-communist paranoia of the same decade. A woman living openly with a female partner in 1952 risked her employment, her custody of any children from a previous marriage, her standing in her community, and in some jurisdictions, actual criminal prosecution. The distance between that reality and today is enormous, though it did not arrive quickly or easily, and it arrived through the sustained effort of people who took real risks across decades. The Supreme Court's 2015 decision in Obergefell v. Hodges established a nationwide right to same-sex marriage, meaning a woman today can marry the person she loves, regardless of gender, with full legal recognition, full inheritance rights, full parental rights over children raised together, protections that were entirely unavailable, and in many cases actively criminalized, throughout the entire period we've spent the last several hours describing. If you are a woman who loves a woman, your Tuesday, the ordinary one we've been walking through tonight, includes an entire dimension of legally recognized, socially increasingly unremarkable love that the woman standing in the corner of the 1952 kitchen could not have imagined existing in any form beyond secrecy and danger. Let's bring this back towards something gentler, something that touches nearly every part of the day we've already walked through. Your connection to the rest of the world, sitting quietly in your pocket. Think about the phone in your hand right now or on the nightstand beside you. Through this single object, you can speak instantly face to face with your mother on another continent, with a friend from college scattered to a different coastline, with a colleague in a different country entirely, at any hour, for as long as you like, at essentially no cost beyond what you're already paying for the service itself. You can access, through the same object, nearly the entire accumulated recorded knowledge of human civilization, medical information, historical records, instructional videos for skills you've never learned, translations of languages you don't speak, all instantly. All without requiring anyone's permission or gatekeeping expertise, standing between you and the information. The 1950s housewife's connection to the world beyond her immediate household ran through a small number of tightly controlled channels. The telephone, often a shared party line limiting both privacy and availability. The daily newspaper, curated and edited by an overwhelmingly male editorial establishment. The evening news broadcast, similarly filtered, and whatever her husband chose to relay from his own day in the world beyond the home. Her access to information, to distant relationships, to the broader currents of thought and event moving through the world, was mediated, constrained, and frequently secondhand. Yours tonight is direct, immediate, and entirely under your own control, a difference so total that it's genuinely difficult to overstate its cumulative effect on the shape of a modern woman's inner and outer life alike. Let's think for a moment about something specific: research. If you wanted to understand a medical symptom you were experiencing, a legal question about a lease you were signing, the reputation of a company you were considering working for, the safety record of a car you were thinking of buying, you could, this evening, in about 10 minutes, gather more reliable, more comprehensive information than the 1950s housewife could have gathered in a week of library visits and phone calls, if she'd had the transportation and the time to make them at all. This isn't a small convenience. It's a fundamental shift in the balance of power between you and every institution, every salesperson, every professional you deal with, because you are never required to simply trust what you're told. You can check. We're approaching the end of the day now, the hours after dinner, when the house grows quiet and the specific texture of an evening belonging to no one but yourself finally settles in. Let's spend a little time there before we bring this long night to its close. If you're reading tonight in the actual final minutes before sleep, whatever you're reading is yours by choice, undisguised, requiring no nightstand drawer discretion. If it's a novel about a woman with a complicated inner life, ambitious, difficult, uncertain, dissatisfied, pursuing something the people around her don't entirely understand, you can read it on your coffee table in plain daylight, discuss it openly with your book club, recommend it to your mother, without the specific quiet camouflage the 1950s reader required. The gap between what a woman was allowed to want out loud and what she was allowed to want in the privacy of her own head has narrowed enormously, though perhaps never fully closed, because privacy itself remains, for every person in every century, a genuinely different register from public declaration. But narrowed enormously is not nothing. It is, in fact, close to everything, when you consider it against the specific starting point of a woman who kept her most honest thoughts hidden inside fiction, because fiction was the only form honest enough to hold them, and safe enough to be found. Before we go any further, let's pause and do something the culture of the 1950s never really allowed itself to do about its own moment: an honest accounting of what still isn't finished. Because a story that only celebrates progress isn't really being truthful with you, and truthfulness is the whole point of these long, quiet nights together. The gender wage gap, though narrowed considerably since the middle of the 20th century, has not closed. Women working full-time in the United States still earn, on average, roughly 80-some cents for every dollar earned by men, according to recent Census Bureau data, a gap that widens further for many women of color, and narrows but does not disappear even when researchers control carefully for occupation, experience, and hours worked. The reasons behind the remaining gap are debated among economists, some of it tied to occupational segregation, some to the motherhood penalty that continues to depress women's earnings after childbirth in ways that don't equivalently affect fathers, some to more direct forms of discrimination that persist quietly inside hiring and promotion decisions. Whatever the precise mixture of causes, the gap is real. It is measured every year, and it means your Tuesday, for all its genuine freedom, still exists inside an economy that has not yet finished the work of valuing your labor identically to a man's. The mental load we mentioned earlier, the invisible, ongoing cognitive work of tracking a household's needs, remembering the pediatrician appointment, noticing the school supply list, managing the family's social calendar, remains disproportionately carried by women even in households that consider themselves genuinely equal partnerships, according to sociological research on household labor that has accumulated steadily since the 1980s. This isn't the same as the 1950s arrangement, not remotely, because today it's contested, discussed, actively renegotiated in millions of individual relationships. But contested is not the same as resolved, and it would be dishonest to suggest the ledger has been fully balanced simply because the conversation about balancing it is now allowed to happen out loud. Representation at the highest levels of corporate and political leadership remains, similarly, incomplete. Women hold a minority of Fortune 500 chief executive positions, a minority of seats in Congress relative to their share of the population, a minority of partner positions at major law firms and venture capital firms, despite now earning the majority of college degrees and entering the professional workforce in roughly equal numbers to men at the entry level. Something happens across the span of a career. Researchers call it various things: a leaky pipeline, a glass ceiling, a broken rung at the first step into management, that thins the representation of women as you move up nearly every professional hierarchy in the country. The doors that were locked in 1952 have been unlocked. Not all of them swing as easily as the others, even now. And we should say plainly, too, that everything we've described tonight describes a general legal and cultural landscape, not a universally lived experience. Access to all of these freedoms, the credit, the healthcare, the reproductive choice, the legal protection from violence, the flexible working arrangements, remains genuinely unequal along lines of income, geography, immigration status, disability, and race, in ways that mean the specific Tuesday we've walked through tonight is considerably easier to access for some women than others, even within the same country, even within the same city, sometimes even within the same family. A full accounting of where things stand has to hold both truths simultaneously: extraordinary, historically unprecedented progress since 1952, and a distance still remaining to travel before that progress reaches everyone equally. Tonight is not a victory lap. It's a long look backward and forward at the same time. Now let's return, gently, to something more domestic, more physically grounded, because it's a comfortable place to rest before we bring this night to its close. The actual physical labor of running a household, and how thoroughly it has been transformed by machines the 1950s housewife would have found genuinely miraculous. We spent real time, in the earlier episode, describing her relationship with the ringer washer giving way to the automatic washing machine, the pressure cooker that occasionally, terrifyingly, failed, the electric range that replaced the intuitive heat cues of a gas flame with an unreadable glowing coil. Tonight, in your own home, the machines have continued their quiet advance so far past her imagination that describing your kitchen to her would sound, frankly, like reading her a page from a science fiction novel. Your washing machine, if you're doing laundry tonight, likely has a dozen cycle settings calibrated to fabric type, water temperature, and soil level, determined automatically by sensors rather than your own judgment. And your dryer, an appliance her generation had barely begun to acquire, finishes the job entirely, removing the entire hours-long project of the outdoor clothesline and the specific social performance of hanging laundry in view of the neighbors. Your dishwasher, an appliance that existed in 1952 but remained a rare luxury item found in a small minority of American homes, handles the after-dinner cleanup that once consumed a significant chunk of her evening, standing at a sink with her hands submerged in hot water for the better part of an hour after every single meal. If you cook dinner tonight, and choose to, rather than being required to, you might use a microwave, an appliance that did not exist commercially until the late 1960s and did not become a common household fixture until the 1970s, capable of reheating or even fully cooking food in minutes rather than the careful, hours-long backward planning her thawing, prepping, and oven timing required. You might order dinner instead, from any of dozens of restaurants, delivered directly to your door by a stranger tracked in real time on a map on your phone, an entire category of convenience that collapses her multi-hour production into a 5-minute phone interaction and a 20-minute wait. Consider what this means in terms of raw hours. Time-use studies conducted by economists tracking American household labor across the 20th century, including research published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, have found that the time an average American woman spends on housework has dropped dramatically since the 1950s, by more than half in many categories, even as the size and expectations of homes have in some respects grown. This is not simply a story of women working less. Many of you reading this are also working full-time paid jobs that the 1950s housewife did not hold, so the total hours in a day remain just as fully occupied as hers were. But the specific category of unpaid domestic labor that consumed the near entirety of her waking hours has been genuinely, measurably compressed by the machines quietly humming in your kitchen and laundry room right now. Let's talk for a moment about grocery shopping, because even this most basic of tasks has transformed in ways worth sitting with. If you needed groceries tonight, you might have ordered them from your phone, selected by an algorithm that remembers your usual purchases, delivered to your door within the hour by someone else entirely, requiring no drive, no parking, no negotiation of a toddler through crowded aisles, no careful calculation of a meat budget stretched precisely across a week's worth of dinners under the fluorescent lights of a supermarket you had to reach by whatever transportation was available to you on a day your husband happened to leave the car behind. Or you went yourself, driving your own car, using a payment method entirely your own, selecting whatever you wanted based on your own preferences and your own budget, answerable to no one for the specific choices you made in aisle 7. Now, let's talk about something quieter and warmer to close this section. The relationship between you and the women who came before you in your own family, because this thread runs underneath everything we've discussed tonight in a very personal, very specific way. If you have a grandmother, or had one, there's a real chance she lived through some meaningful portion of exactly the life we described in such detail in the earlier episode about the 1950s housewife. She may have risen before dawn to be presentable before her husband woke. She may have managed a household budget with real skill, while having no legal standing to open a credit account in her own name. She may have swallowed a Milton tablet at some point in the 1950s or 1960s, prescribed for a nervousness whose actual source no one around her was equipped to name. She may have read a novel in secret, in the 30 minutes before sleep, and recognized something of her own unspoken wanting in its pages, and told no one. If you've ever had a conversation with her, or with a gray-tan, or with any woman old enough to remember that decade firsthand about what her actual daily life was like, you may have noticed something in the way she describes it, a kind of careful understatement, a tendency to describe genuine hardship in mild, almost cheerful terms. That's just how things were. We didn't think about it that way. You did what needed doing. This isn't necessarily denial. It's often simply the residue of an entire life spent inside a culture that required cheerfulness as a baseline condition, that never gave her the vocabulary to describe her own experience as anything other than normal, because normal was the only framework available to name it with. You, tonight, carry inside you the accumulated outcome of her endurance, and the endurance of millions of women like her, each one absorbing a little more strain than the culture around her acknowledged, each one pushing, in whatever small way was available to her, a door that opened, eventually, wide enough for you to walk through without even noticing it had ever been shut. Let's talk about flexibility, a word that barely had meaning inside the rigid architecture of the 1950s household, and that shapes an enormous amount of your own working life today. If you work from home, even occasionally, even just on the days your child is sick or a repair technician needs to be let into your house, you're exercising a kind of professional flexibility that simply had no equivalent in the mid-20th century workplace, which the 1950s working woman, rare as she was, would have entered on terms designed entirely around a male worker's assumed domestic support system. A wife managing everything else so that his presence at the office could be total and uninterrupted. You today might negotiate your hours around school pickup, around a medical appointment, around simply needing an afternoon to recover from a difficult week. And increasingly, employers are expected, sometimes by law, sometimes by simple competitive necessity in a tight labor market, to accommodate this negotiation rather than treating it as evidence of insufficient commitment. The remote work expansion that accelerated dramatically in the early 2020s, following the global disruptions of that period, has had a particular and well-documented effect on women's labor force participation. Research from economists at institutions including the Federal Reserve and various university labor economics departments having found that flexible and remote arrangements have allowed many women, particularly mothers, to remain attached to the paid workforce during years when the rigid all-or-nothing structure of traditional office employment might otherwise have pushed them out entirely. This is not a universally available benefit. Plenty of jobs, particularly lower wage and hourly positions, offer far less flexibility than white-collar remote-capable roles, and this unevenness is worth nomming honestly. But the mere existence of flexibility as a legitimate, increasingly expected feature of modern employment represents a genuine structural shift away from the all-consuming, inflexible demands the workplace made of anyone, male or female, in the middle of the last century. Let's talk now about something the 1950s culture handled with almost no grace at all: disability, and the specific compounding difficulty of being a woman navigating both gender expectations and a body or mind that worked differently than the culture's narrow template assumed. If you live with a disability, chronic illness, or a body that requires accommodation to function fully in daily and professional life, you are protected today, at least on paper, by the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, legislation that requires employers, public accommodations, and government services to provide reasonable accommodation rather than simply excluding people whose bodies or minds didn't match an assumed default. This protection did not exist in any comparable form in 1952, when a woman with a physical disability, a chronic illness, a mental health condition, or a neurodivergent mind faced not only the general constraints placed on all women of the era, but frequently an additional layer of institutional exclusion, sometimes formal, sometimes simply the unaddressed absence of any accommodation whatsoever, from workplaces, from public buildings, from the medical establishment's understanding of her own body. The specific language and framework of neurodivergence, conditions like ADHD or autism understood today with far greater nuance and far less stigma than the mid-century psychiatric establishment offered, has expanded considerably in recent decades, allowing many women who might have spent the 1950s being quietly labeled nervous, difficult, or simply strange, to instead understand their own minds through a framework that explains rather than merely judges. This understanding remains imperfect, diagnostic gaps and biases persist, particularly for women, who are still frequently diagnosed later in life than men presenting similar traits, according to research published in various psychiatric and psychological journals over the past 2 decades. But the framework exists now, evolving, imperfect, genuinely helpful to many, in a way that offered the 1950s woman living with an undiagnosed difference essentially nothing beyond the vague, dismissive vocabulary of nerves and adjustment. Let's slow down again now, because we're approaching the close of this long night together, and it's worth gathering everything we've walked through into a single quiet, unhurried moment before we let it settle completely. Think back to the very beginning of tonight's story, to the woman standing quietly in the corner of your kitchen, watching you hit snooze on your alarm, watching you shuffle to the coffee maker in yesterday's clothes, watching you press a single button and receive, without any of the anxious percolator calculations that governed her own mornings, a competent cup of coffee. Imagine her watching the rest of your day unfold as we've described it. Your drive alone in your own car, your meeting at work where your opinion was recorded and acted upon, your lunch eaten alone in a restaurant without explanation required, your bank balance checked without permission, your body's reproductive choices made entirely by you, your disagreement with a partner voiced and received as legitimate, your evening spent partly on something that produced nothing but your own enjoyment, your eventual sleep, tonight, in a bed that belongs in every legal and practical sense. To you, she would not recognize this life as domestic in the sense she understood the word. She would recognize it instead as something closer to what she read about quietly, in the pages of the nightstand novel, in the specific fictional women who wanted things and pursued them and suffered real consequences for the wanting, except that in your life, the consequences she feared, the social exile, the financial ruin, the medical dismissal, the legal powerlessness, have been so substantially dismantled that the wanting itself has become almost unremarkable. A simple feature of an ordinary Tuesday rather than a dangerous private rebellion requiring careful concealment. We're going to bring this night to its close now, gently, the way we always do, gathering everything into a final quiet reflection before we let you drift the rest of the way into sleep. Let your body settle fully into the mattress. Let your breathing slow all the way down. There's just a little further to go. Let's talk about something the 1950s domestic culture treated with almost total silence. A woman's own sexuality, discussed openly, understood clinically, and pursued as her own legitimate domain of pleasure rather than something managed entirely for someone else's benefit. If you've ever had an open, informed conversation with a doctor, a partner, or a friend about your own sexual health, your own satisfaction, your own body's actual functioning, you are participating in a level of candor that the culture surrounding the 1950s housewife did not meaningfully permit. Alfred Kinsey's 1953 report on female sexuality, sexual behavior in the human female, caused genuine cultural shock precisely because it suggested, based on actual interview data, that women's sexual experiences and desires were far more varied and considerably less passive than the domestic ideal of the era assumed or permitted anyone to discuss. The report was controversial, criticized, in some circles outright condemned. But it represented one of the first moments a mainstream American institution treated female sexuality as a subject worthy of serious, direct study, rather than a topic to be managed through silence and euphemism. Today, you have access to accurate, evidence-based information about your own body's sexual health through a doctor trained to discuss it directly rather than through the vague, moralizing evasions that characterize so much mid-century medical and cultural guidance. You can discuss what you actually want, physically and emotionally, with a partner, as a legitimate subject of mutual negotiation rather than a topic your own satisfaction was rarely centered within. This is, again, an area where real inequality and real gaps in medical research persist, women's pain and women's specific health conditions remaining, even now, understudied relative to men's in significant areas of medical research, according to ongoing critiques from within the medical research community itself. But the basic premise, that your own experience in this domain of life is worth nomming, discussing, and improving, represents a genuinely different starting point than the near-total silence that surrounded the subject in 1952. Let's talk now about how women are actually shown to the world. On screen, in the media that surrounds you, because we discussed at length, in the earlier episode, how thoroughly 1950s television constructed an ideal of womanhood cheerful, patient, entirely defined by domestic competence, broadcasting that image into millions of households as though it were simply a documentary record of what women were. Tonight, if you turned on a television or opened a streaming service, you would find a range of women represented on screen that would have been almost unrecognizable to the 1950s viewer. Women depicted as surgeons, as detectives, as scientists, as messy and imperfect and ambitious, and sometimes deeply unlikable. Women whose stories center their own internal conflict rather than existing purely as a supporting device inside a husband's or a child's narrative. This range is not perfect, and media criticism continues correctly to point out persistent patterns. Women still frequently underrepresented behind the camera as directors and writers, even when well represented in front of it. Certain roles and story types still disproportionately narrow. But the sheer variety available, the fact that no single television archetype dominates the cultural image of womanhood, the way June Cleaver's cheerful, unflappable domesticity once did, represents a genuine widening of what a woman's story is permitted to be. Consider, too, the advertising that surrounds you, because we discussed at length how the 1950s advertisement functioned as a direct instrument of domestic ideology, selling products by embedding them in an aspirational image of contented housewifery. Modern advertising remains, of course, still deeply invested in selling you things, and still frequently invested in particular, sometimes unrealistic images of female beauty and domestic competence. But it exists now alongside genuine cultural pushback, advertising campaigns explicitly built around challenging narrow beauty standards, around depicting women in professional and athletic contexts rather than exclusively domestic ones, around at least gesturing toward the acknowledgement that women's lives extend well beyond the kitchen. The 1950s advertisement so thoroughly confined them to. Now, let's bring all of this together, gently, the way we do at the end of every one of these long nights, and let the whole shape of what we've walked through settle into something you can actually rest inside. Think back across everything we've covered tonight. The alarm you silenced without consequence, the coffee made by machine rather than by decades of accumulated anxiety, the car you drove alone, the meeting you ran, the lunch you ate unaccompanied without explanation, the bank account that answers to no one but you, the pill or the choice that determines whether your body takes on the responsibility of another life, the doctor who spoke to you rather than around you, the disagreement you voiced at dinner without fear, the name you kept or changed entirely by your own decision, the divorce that remains available to you should you ever need it, on your own initiative, for reasons that require no courtroom proof. The friendship conducted in full honesty rather than careful, deniable hints. The therapist who asks what in your circumstances might need to change. The degree you earned in numbers that would have seemed a statistical impossibility in 1952. The vote you cast as an unremarkable civic duty rather than a hard one, recently granted right. The business you might run entirely on your own financial standing. The love you're permitted to pursue in whatever form it actually takes. The phone in your pocket connecting you instantly to the entire world. The evening hour you spent doing something that produced nothing but your own quiet pleasure. None of this arrived by accident, and none of it arrived quickly. Each single piece we've described tonight, the credit card, the no-fault divorce, the pregnancy protection, the same-sex marriage right, the college enrollment, the vote itself, was fought for, specifically, deliberately, over years and often decades, by women whose names you may never learn, whose individual efforts accumulated slowly into the specific, unremarkable freedoms you exercise today without a single conscious thought about any of it. That unconsciousness, that total unremarkability, is not a failure of memory. It's the actual intended outcome of the work itself. Nobody who fought to open a bank account without a husband's signature was fighting so that future generations would think about the fight every time they used a debit card. They were fighting so that future generations would never have to think about it at all, so that the freedom would simply become the invisible, unremarked-upon texture of an ordinary life. The same way you don't think each morning about the specific historical struggle that secured your right to vote, or to own property, or to leave a marriage that isn't working. And yet, on a night like tonight, it's worth thinking about it just once, just for a few quiet hours before sleep, not out of guilt. And not out of some obligation to feel constantly grateful for every ordinary thing, but simply out of the particular pleasure of understanding your own life a little more fully. You are the specific, living outcome of an enormous, largely uncelebrated collective effort, carried out across generations, inside kitchens and courtrooms and legislatures and living rooms, by women who could not have imagined your specific Tuesday in any concrete detail, but who worked, in whatever way was available to them, toward exactly this kind of ordinary, unremarkable freedom, because it was the only gift they could actually give to a future they would never personally get to see. Sleep well tonight in whatever version of your own imperfect, complicated, genuinely free life you've built for yourself, with its full and unremarkable access to your own name, your own money, your own body, your own opinions, and your own unhurried thoughts, drifting now gently toward morning.